I thought we were doing questions, and I'm gonna bring up my phone so that I have notes, so that I don't stray, because I want to make sure I hit all the points. But I always start the same way, so I don't need notes for that. I was down in DC 2 weeks ago, Kathleen? Mm-hmm. 2 weeks ago. Kathleen was on the other van. And I went down 2 weeks ago to protest on the anniversary of the Kavanaugh confirmation. And I went with a group of Mainers. I drove a van overnight on Saturday night, and we got there on Saturday morning. We did a training at 8 o'clock on Saturday morning for civil disobedience. And by 2 o'clock, I think, on Sunday afternoon, overnight Saturday to Sunday, I was tied up with caution tape in the middle of an intersection in front of the Supreme Court. And so I say that to say, I was mad 2 weeks ago, and I'm still as mad as I was then, and I'm probably madder than I was a year and 2 weeks ago when I went to Susan Collins' office in DC to try and stop the Kavanaugh vote. I did not ever intend to run for office. This was not part of my life plan. I have green hair. I went down to Susan Collins' office because, as an attorney, I was appalled by the partisanship in the process of nominating a Supreme Court justice. Because that's not about left or right, that's about how the law works. And I thought I could trust Susan Collins to see that. And so I went down to DC after trying to meet with her, calling, sending emails, not being able to get a meeting, and I showed up at her office and I knocked on the door. And nobody came out, so I put my ear up to the door and I heard some footsteps, so I knocked again and I kept knocking until someone came out. And that person came out and was like, "Can I help you?" And I said, "I need to talk to my senator. This is important." So we wound up getting a meeting for the next day, and I showed up with my stack of research on case law and the Federalist Papers and how the confirmation process is supposed to work. And I said, "I just want to know what Susan Collins is thinking about in making this decision." And the answer that I got was, "She's got a lot to think about." It's okay. Can you tell me some of the things that she's thinking about? She's got a lot to think about. Can anybody here shout out what she was thinking about? Money, 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 money. Betsy's got it. It was money. And so a lot of people say Susan Collins isn't the senator that she used to be. What changed that? Money, 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 money. There we go. And to be clear, that's money to get reelected, right? Like, elections are expensive. So I want to see by a show of hands, how many people in this room think that you can buy an election? Yeah, that's a good more than half. How many people think that you should buy an election? The total is still at 0 across the state. Everywhere I've spoken, I've asked this question, and it's always 0. So, how do we get that discrepancy? By letting it happen. We're the voters. We're the people who have the choices. We're the people who can look at this process. It is reported. It's just not reported very often in the media. Sorry, Steve. But so if you look at the media, I mean, that's all they talk about really when it comes to races. Who has the most money? But that doesn't really say a whole lot about who makes the best decisions. If there's one thing you take away from the next few moments of talking with me, I hope it's this. Process matters. Signaling progressivism without using our shared values is a recipe for something hollow, and going into 2020, we need to be solid. We need to do the hard work of using our values in the process to ensure that the crumbling foundations of our democracy can be reinforced, to make sure that our country can be saved. I want to congratulate Sarah on her $3.2 million donation haul. It has allowed her to become the first candidate possibly in Maine history to go live on TV 9 months before the primary, and to make headlines across the country as the media compares her fundraising to Susan Collins. Some articles contain graphs which can differentiate between the millions in Sarah and Susan's accounts, but Betsy, John, and I all look like we've raised nothing on those graphs, despite multitudes of difference in the amount of fundraising that each of the three of us has done. In those articles, Betsy, John, and I are usually footnotes, and that will continue to be true because the current system believes that buying the election is the only way, and simply put, we can't afford to buy the election the way that Sarah is adeptly showing that she can and will. None of us have raised even half of what Sarah has spent on Facebook alone. But that doesn't mean we don't matter. Betsy is the reason we have clean elections in Maine. John is a retired Air Force general. I'm an attorney who uses the Constitution every day and who has worked in federal policy. You won't hear that in most of the media. So if you want to make sure that our primary election can't be bought, because we've all agreed that it shouldn't be, we need you to tell your friends, tell your family, tell your coworkers about us. We've all already agreed that an election shouldn't be bought, but it's on us to make sure it doesn't happen because we're not going to beat Susan Collins unless we stand by our values. A wise legislator once said, or probably said many times because it's Barney Frank, government is the name we give to things that we decide to do together. At the Maine People's Alliance dinner, Alicia Garza said something that I haven't been able to get out of my head, and that's that power is about who gets to make decisions. The Democratic Party is at a crossroads, and the crux of it is this. We need to make some decisions together about who gets to make decisions. When we have primarily very wealthy people at the table, it means that very wealthy people are deciding what the government is going to be for all of us. As the first non-binary person to run for Senate in US history, I am acutely aware that there has never been a transgender person in a position to make decisions on federal legislation. In 2015, when I was a law fellow at the National Center for Transgender Equality, I listened to Barney Frank speak to interns at HRC about not devaluing incrementalism, about how all big changes come in small waves. That summer, marriage equality won, and I worked on a tiny shift in language that would become part of a rule allowing transgender people experiencing homelessness to access shelters according to their self-identified gender. Gay marriage isn't going anywhere, having had the benefit of decades of legislators like Barney Frank working on incremental change, but the Trump administration is rolling back equal access to shelters for trans people, revoking trans people's passports, and even removing protections for trans people in healthcare settings. When I was in DC 2 weeks ago, protesting outside the Supreme Court with hundreds of trans people who got arrested rallying while the Supreme Court heard arguments about whether or not we can be fired just for who we are. The statistics say that all of this would be a harder sell if we could get a trans person in the room. But in order to do that, we would have to overcome our own biases about whether a trans person could be electable. We would, in essence, have to make space at the table, treat people whose rights we say we value as valid contributors to the narrative, and stop speaking over people who are directly impacted by policy decisions. The same is true of people who are working class and middle class. If we say we care about the needs of working class and middle class people, the most direct way to do that is to let working class and middle class people make decisions about the policies that we're living with. That can't happen if you have to raise millions of dollars to make a decision. The same is true of young people who will be trying to raise our families as the sea levels rise. In 2050, I will be 62 years old. Assuming I don't perish in the first wave of catastrophic floods with my little house in Saco, I'll have a few decades left to live with the consequences of decisions being made now. But unless something changes, those decisions will all have been made without the input or the consent of the people who are going to be living with them. The legitimacy of a government depends on the consent of the governed. So the way we choose our decision makers informs the way decisions get made and the legitimacy of our government as a whole. If we continue to decide that a person has to be able to raise a lot of money in order to be a decision maker, then we force our decision makers to focus on accumulating wealth, staying connected to wealthy people, and riling up donors with urgent fundraising emails instead of working through legitimate concerns in proposed legislation and working with constituents to ensure our representation truly represents us. This is how we lost Susan Collins. So my campaign is an exercise in what if. What if we could do this differently? What if we could decide that we're not going to stand for this anymore? What if candidates prioritize doing good for the voting public instead of fundraising to tell people what good they might do? What if we stopped reporting on campaign fundraising and instead focused on actions and ideas? And what if we put the money we did raise into charitable efforts in Maine communities? Can we make the good speak for itself? I plan to find out. I'm not so naive as to believe that getting the word out doesn't cost anything, but think about who gets to make decisions and what we decide to do together. If we prioritize fundraising for the party and let the selection of candidates focus on ideas, we make room for the people closest to the issues to make decisions about how they're handled. In essence, focusing fundraising efforts on the party, on what we all choose to do together, ensures that our values reinforce the process of deciding who gets to make decisions. And that's the kind of Democratic Party that I can have hope for in 2020 and beyond. Thank you.